So, continuing this idea of the will as being the point in which we decide to be disciples and decide to continue each time into the discipleship process. How does the will empower us to be disciples? And how does God empower the will to make godly choices? I'm going to look at this, and we're going to look at this through the idea of this whole person. God engages our will to make godly choices. First and foremost, let's look at what our will can do with these godly choices as it relates to the other pieces of the person. The will, and probably the place where the will has the most power, is in the thoughts. The will can choose what we choose to think about. Sometimes we're interrupted by thoughts that are just, invasive, but quite often what we concentrate on, what we dwell on, what we can think about on a consistent basis, the will can choose those. How we think is probably the area of our life that the will has the most power over. So the will is less likely to have power over emotions. Quite often, we can't will ourselves to not have fear, to be to have to avoid being afraid. We can't will ourselves to have joy, but we can will ourselves to think thoughts about things that may cause feelings. So if we will us to think the right thoughts, thinking the right thoughts might and often does produce good feelings. Also, quite often we have trouble willing our bodies to do certain things, but we do have a willful control over our bodies. It might not be as powerful on some. Someone who is trained for a marathon might have a very willful control over how they engage their bodies, but someone who isn't that practiced in using their will to engage their bodies might need to start someplace else. But if we use our will to engage our thoughts then produce a certain type of emotions, which then makes it easier for our will to engage our bodies in the right direction. So if we get that inner wheel working of will, thought, emotions, feelings, and then engage the body, it is much more productive when our body is engaged with a healthy working inner wheel of will, thoughts, and feelings working together. Now, we can't will much control over our social context. Quite often, willing people to do and behave around you the way you want is a way to get into trouble. But we can somehow make sure our willful decisions when we are in a social context are the result of willful decisions, good thoughts, godly feelings, and having our body in our control instead of having our body control our other things. So if our will engages our thoughts, which then supports our feelings, allows us to use our body in a positive way in whatever social context we find ourselves. That is kind of how the will helps us throughout the entire person to engage in godliness across all of who we are. Secondly, how does God empower the will? And this is fun because we can see that God empowers our will, but he can use all of the other parts of our person to do that. If we are engaged in, say, a good church, that social context can therefore influence us in how we use our will. That social context can change our thoughts. That social context can change our feelings. That social context can be a way God engages us to make godly decisions through our will. God can help us to have godly thoughts through the study of Scripture, through prayer. God can infuse us with godly feelings like joy or peace or fear, and that can help us make godly choices. Our body, now, this is a hard one. Sometimes God can engage our body in a context where our body gives up, and it forces us to rest and make the godly decision of rest. Our body might actually, if we avoid making godly decisions with our body, through our body might actually give us strong physical signals that we may need to make better choices with our bodies. So both our will can impact every other aspect of our person, and then every other aspect can impact our use of the will, and God can engage and empower our will through using these other aspects of our person. This is the idea that a well-discipled person is somebody who all five of these parts are working in harmony for Christ-likeness.